Welcome back to the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel. My name is Cameron Lawrence, and today we're going to talk about my top 5 picks for the Fantasy Football MVP of the 2023 season. And for me, Fantasy Football MVP is just a little bit more than finishing best at your position. It's finishing really well compared to where your ADP was, making you the most valuable pick, obviously. But without further ado, let's start with our first pick, Tony Pollard, who goes off the board as the running back 8 overall. And if you have followed us at all this offseason, myself, Lucas, and especially Tyler, you know that we all believe that Pollard has RB1 overall potential this season. And if you can snag him in the second round with a Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, or Saquon Barkley, man, you're going to be in for a wild ride. And if you've already drafted, I would, at pretty much any cost, go out and try to acquire Tony Pollard because of the upside that he does possess. Last season, he was first in yards after contact, 5th in yards per touch, 8th in yards created per touch, and was the RB8. While being in the backfield was Ezekiel Elliott, who had 243 touches last season. This season, 0 competition for touches, unless you consider Ronald Jones, Malik Davis, and if I hear one more person try and tell me that Deuce Vaughn is all of a sudden going to come in and steal all of his carries and make him fantasy irrelevant, my brain is going to explode. It's not a lot of you, but the few of you that are talking like that, we got to settle down a little bit. A couple fourth quarter runs in a preseason game doesn't mean much. Sorry. Getting on a tangent there. I'll get back to what you came for, and that is talking our fantasy football MVPs. This season, like I said, no competition for back in the backfield. And his head coach and OC, the two guys calling the plays, I would consider them being overly too committed to the run, which is obviously going to be good for Tony Pollard this season. The only argument that people have against Tony Pollard is he can't handle a workload. Let me give you a little newsflash for you. That's an awful argument. That's a lousy argument. He had 242 touches last year. He had the same amount as Zeke. And yes, he got hurt week 17. But it was a fluky fracture. It's not something that's going to be reoccurring. It's not going to be a hamstring or an ACL tear that's going to keep coming up. Tony Pollard is just fine. He is ready to go. And if he can put together a streak like he did from week 8 to when he got hurt at the end of the season, where he was averaging 22 points per game, where he was the running back 2 with 2 more points per game than the running back 3, he should definitely and is definitely a front runner to finish as the fantasy football MVP. Except we have Chris Olave, who goes around after Pollard, and in my opinion, will have the best sophomore season out of anybody in that 2022 wide receiver class. I know this is bold, especially with Garrett Wilson connecting with Aaron Rodgers. But what I'm seeing from the Saints team, how they're shaping up right now, it's reminding me a little bit of what we saw from the Raiders last season. They have a bottom half defense. Wide receiver room and tight end room is ambiguous at best. Now, I know the Saints won't have the same running back room, but that honestly might help Chris Olave even more. It's going to lead a lot to Derek Carr throwing the ball to Chris Olave, which obviously we want to see. And before I get into these next stats, because I got a couple stats I want to give to you, I don't want you to think that I'm saying that Chris Olave is Devontae Adams. I hold Devontae Adams in a very special tier right now. I know how amazing he is, so I don't want you to think that that is what I'm trying to do. However, what these stats are going to show you is Olave is going to step into a very similar situation that Devontae had last season, and that he's pretty decent in his own right with a similar skill set to what Devontae had to use last year. And so that is all I'm trying to show you. I'm not trying to say they're the same. I just want to clarify that. But last year, Devontae was first in target share. Derek Carr is known for hyper-targeting his wide receiver 1. He was first in air yards, 2nd in deep targets, 5th in red zone targets, 3rd in receiving yards, and 8th in yards per route run. His yards per reception was 15.2 yards, and he had a target rate of 30%. Now for Olave, he had a target share of 27%. He was targeted on 30% of his routes run. His yards per reception was 14.5, pretty similar to what we've seen Devontae at last year. He was 10th in yards per route run, just behind Adams, and he was 4th in deep targets. The one thing that Olave lacked was red zone targets, was touchdowns last year. He only had 4. That's why we weren't talking about Olave in a similar breath to Jalen Waddle, in a similar breath to a Ja'Marr Chase and Justin Jefferson. Obviously, he didn't have the same caliber of rookie season as those three guys, but touchdowns were something that really held him back, where we can't really compare where they finished at fantasy-wise. But the role that Olave played last year was extremely similar to what Devontae Adams was in last season. He just obviously wasn't used quite as much in the same exact way because he was a rookie. But now with Derek Carr, he is stepping into that role that saw Adams as a wide receiver 3. Again, not saying Olave is Adams, so I'm not going to say that he's wide receiver 3 this season. But he's going as wide receiver 13 right now, and if he can find his way into the top 5, this is going to be a completely different conversation that we're going to be having about him next year. If you guys have followed along with Fantasy Football Fellas at all this season, if you follow my personals at CamelaFFF, quick shameless plug on every social media you can look for. If you followed the YouTube videos we've put out, if you followed the podcast videos, you knew that this guy was going to be on this list, and that is Jahmyr Gibbs. I have continually talked about it. I feel like I've been repeating myself all offseason, but I have to keep beating this drum. I feel the same way about Tony Pollard. I feel the same way about Chris Olave. If you haven't drafted yet, find a way to get him on your team. If you have drafted already, find a way to get him on your team. It doesn't matter. You've still got a couple days of the start of the season. Get him on your team now because you're going to be really disappointed by week 3 when he's not on your team. But a lot of people are going to say, Monty's going to lead this team in rush attempts. Yes. Despite that fact, I still think he can finish top 10. In fact, in 2017, 2 rookies, Alvin Kamara and Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey was drafted as a top 12 pick, the same as Jahmyr Gibbs. Both finished top 10 despite not leading their team in rush attempts. And CMC was, in fact, 3rd on his team in rush attempts behind Cam Newton. James White in 2018 finished top 7 despite not leading his team in rush attempts. Austin Eckler was the top 4 in 2019, doing the same. We saw Swift in 2021 finish top 10 in points per game, being behind Jamal Williams. And Tony Pollard, who we talked about earlier, was running back 8 while splitting carries with Ezekiel Elliott. We also need to factor in draft capital because that's really important. And each of the last 6 players drafted top 12, each of the last 6 running backs, drafted top 12, Trent Richardson, Todd Gurley, Ezekiel Elliott, Leonard Fournette, Christian McCaffrey, and Saquon Barkley all finished as top 10 running backs their rookie season, proving once again that draft capital matters. We don't want it to as much as it does, but it does. So now that we've established the historical context for Jahmyr Gibbs, I just want to point out that he's actually a really good running back on top of all that. 6 yards per carry, over 6 yards per carry last year at Bam, just under 4 receptions per game, 114 scrimmage yards a game. And now he's stepping into a role that DeAndre Swift had last season that was on pace for 125 attempts and 85 targets. Cameron, why do you bring that up? Who cares? That's oddly specific. Because every player to hit that since 2017 has finished top 10. And you know what? Last season, DeAndre Swift only played 40% of snaps twice. The coaching staff didn't like him. They went out. They haven't stopped talking about this guy. They love Gibbs. He is going to be better than Swift was last season. There's just too much pointing at him being top 10 that I just don't think we can ignore it. All right, 4th player on this list is Justin Herbert, the only QB on this list. He's going in the end of the 4th, beginning of the 5th round right now. He was the QB 11 last season on 4,700 passing yards, 25 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, 54 rush attempts for 147 rushing yards. I want you to remember that because we're going to come back to that rushing later. But first, let's just recap the season that Justin Herbert just went through. Obviously, we can't make excuses for everything. But if anybody's going to get an excuse from last year from me, it's this guy. He lost Keenan Allen week 1, who wouldn't play a full game again until week 11. He suffered broken rib cartilage in week 2, played through that, didn't even miss a snap. He loses all-pro left tackle, Rashawn Slater, for the season in week 3. That is something that doesn't get talked about enough. Losing your left tackle, especially a player like Rashawn Slater, is a humongous blow. He then loses Mike Williams from week 9 to 13. So he finally gets Keenan back, but he doesn't have Mike Williams. He even had a couple games without either guy. And then he also suffered a shoulder tear in his shoulder labrum tear, Sorry, it's hard for me to get those words out. At some point in the year too, and then had surgery on him in the offseason. This dude was coming through a lot, but now he's going to be fully healthy. His wide receivers are coming back fully healthy. They added Quentin Johnston in the draft. He adds Kellen Moore as his offensive coordinator, who led Dak to be the quarterback 6 over the past 4 years in points per game, who led the Dallas Cowboys to have a top 5 scoring offense over the last 2 seasons. And I think this is going to kind of bring us back to what we saw from Justin Herbert in 2021, where he had 5,000 yards, 38 passing touchdowns. He had 23.3 fantasy points per game. He was the QB2. And one thing that I don't think we can overstate or understate, or however you want to say it, is his rushing that he had. 63 attempts, 302 yards, doubled his rushing yards, and 3 touchdowns, guys. That's an extra 2 fantasy points a game that he could bump back up to. That's something we've seen from his first 2 seasons. Obviously, with the broken rib cartilage last season, losing his left tackle, those things are going to be lacking. And the thing that really gets me excited is 2021. He had 5.6. He had a 5.6 touchdown percentage. 2022 is only 30.5. Yards per attempt in 2021 was 7.5. Yards per attempt last year was only 6.7. Both of those, I think, are going to return to what we've seen with Kellen Moore calling the shots. And I think there's a lot of reason to be excited about Justin Herbert this season. And I really do think that he can challenge the Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen's, and Jalen Hurts for a top 3 spot at the quarterback position. And finally, I'm going to keep this one short, but it's the only tight end on the list, and it's Darren Waller. Obviously, he's battled with injuries. He's played 20 games over the last 2 seasons. Obviously, he's getting older. There are some things that you're like, oh, Cameron, are you sure about Darren Waller? When Darren Waller's on the field, he is really, really good. He is easily the number 1 target on this New York Giants offense. Just from a skill standpoint, from what we've heard from the beat reporters, he is a guy who I believe has the upside that a TJ Hawkinson, that a Kyle Pitts, that I don't think George Kittle has right now, to challenge Mark Andrews and Travis Kelce for the tight end 1 and 2 spot. The reason being, the last time we saw him healthy in 2020, he tied Travis Kelce in targets. He had 17.4 fantasy points per game. Last season, 14 yards per catch. He's still moving downfield. In his first game back from injury in 2021, he had 9 targets. And in his first 2 games in 2020, last season, he was top 10 in both. When he came back the last 4 weeks last season, well, he still wasn't 100%. He was still tight end 6 over that time span. Now he gets Daniel Jones, who I know I haven't been the highest on Daniel Jones, but he can get the job done, and he likes to target guys over the middle. Well, that's where Darren Waller is going to thrive. Darren Waller is in a role that is going to help him thrive. I think he still has the talent, and as long as he is healthy, he is going to easily outperform his current ADP. Well, guys, that is all I have. The season is upon us. We got so much in-season content coming from you guys. I hope that you've been following along. I hope that we've been able to help you with drafts. Make sure you keep watching so we can help you with waivers, buy, sell targets, some underdog pick'ems, our week 1 previews podcast. There's just going to be so much packed in every single week from us, and we are so excited to start the season. But with that, deuces, and I will see you later this week.